So the last time we had this quick discussion about, do we want to talk about kind of binary thinking and the limitations we put on ourselves and how that polarizes things. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that's where you want to go or not.
Yeah, I think that what I notice is that um, that's happening all over the place. So I think we should just talk about it,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Why not? I mean, if you look at politics right now, if you look at the pandemic right now, if you look at social justice and um, the protests right now, if you look
Right.
at just the conversations that are happening, if you look at then how it relates to the world of work, what we've been talking about is that there's tons of it's either this or it's that, right? You either are on this team or you're on that team. You either want to get back to work or you love working from home. You either, want to do virtual or you want to be in person. And like, isn't this an amazing opportunity to actually enter the world of exploration and non-binary thinking?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and I think that whole topic, the more you think about how media works, how social media works, I mean, it is about polarizing things, right? You're either in this camp or you're in this camp.
Yeah. Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit during our last conversation, Joel. And I mean, you and I do lots of conversations with lots of different people. I'm sure people are sick of us by now. But the last time we got together, maybe a month or so ago, and we were talking about our relief recovery resilience, um, I guess, process, right? And talking about how people will go through various stages and then kind of go through them again. But one of the concepts that came up during that conversation was the notion of binary thinking, because we were
Yeah.
talking about as you move from that command and control relief mode into recovery, into the new, and certainly into building resilience, that we can't get too fixated on rigid belief systems and we can't get too fixated on this versus that. And we just thought it would be an interesting idea to reconnect to that. And I could say certainly since then, I mean, just read the paper, watch the news, have
Oh, yeah.
conversations with people, and binaries everywhere.
I think what's interesting for me is trying to figure out, is this to the core of us? I mean, do we always have this mentality of kind of us versus them, or right versus wrong? I mean, we love to draw not so much even comparisons, but just this polarization of thoughts.
Yeah.
And we're seeing it through nearly everything. I mean, you can't get on social media. It would almost be impossible to post something on social media that people would be like, yeah, that seems like a real middle of the road thought. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks for sharing. I'd love to talk about that more.
Yeah, let's get together for coffee. I'd really like to distill that down to something we can both understand. It's almost always somebody either wholeheartedly agreeing or somebody wholeheartedly disagreeing, and in some ways, just kind of launching bombs at the other person. Like if you believe that, then you also probably believe this, that I think is horrible. Or if you believe this, then you don't support that.
Yeah.
And that type of binary thinking is so super constrictive, and especially on some of the bigger issues, things that we're seeing right now with the pandemic, with race relations, with all types of things. It actually minimizes the discussion and the conversations and some of the solutions that can come out of it.
Yeah.
Because it becomes this, you got to be in one or two camps.
Yeah.
And if we're one or two camps, we're essentially facing each other doing battle instead of being side by side and trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually looked this up before we got on. It says, human beings have a strong dramatic instinct towards binary thinking, a basic urge to divide things into two groups and nothing but an empty gap in between. So we have this, why? Because it's easy, right? So path of least resistance, as humans, we're like, well, wherever there's less friction, I'm going to take that. So it is easier to just say, I believe this, therefore, and also we talk about confirmation bias and all these other biases that we have. I'm just going to look for stuff that supports this, because then it's easy. I don't have to get uncomfortable. I don't have to think about whether there are any other issues, examples, perspectives,
Right.
experiences that I need to understand, I can just go, yeah, it's all good because A, B, black, white, X, Y, that's it. And you also talked about, it mitigates or prevents you from opening your mind. And I think about, when we get into politics, we get into, the health crisis, we get into privilege and prejudice, whether it's racism, whether it's Me Too, whether it's any of these big social issues, socio-cultural, political, economic issues. And we can't neatly categorize those because there's so much intersectionality of all that, right? So it's really, I think that this notion of us liking to just put it into these quick little boxes, so we go, I'm in camp A, you're in camp B, either we can be friends or we can't. We have to actually push against and rise above that inclination.
And that's why I go back to my original statement. I'm trying to decide if it is our natural inclination to go there, or if it's just reinforcement by society and by our upbringing and all that. But I find it fascinating that we like to look at the world from a very binary perspective, but we like to look at ourselves as very nuanced, right?
Yeah.
So regardless of what issue, I can look at somebody else and go, well, I know I don't agree with them, right? Or I know I do agree with them. But if you were to push me on some of the things that I think I believe in, I would make it very nuanced. Well, in this situation, I believe this, and maybe in that, I think somewhat different, or maybe, in this relationship, I would say this, but not in this one. But we give ourselves a lot of grace in that. We think that we're on a spectrum, but then we look at the world as you've got to be in one camp or the other.
Yeah.
There's almost a simplicity piece to it, right? It's, or maybe it's a little of that lizard brain of just like, are they on my side or are they a threat?
Yeah.
And if they're a threat, then they're all in the other camp. They're not like me.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that I've realized, especially over the last month, and more specifically around racial inequality and discrimination and bias, is instead of trying to determine what camp somebody's in, or to try to either refute or reinforce their point, is just to try to ask questions, just like, Catherine, what do you mean by that? And what would that look like in this situation? And not so that I put Catherine on the spot so that now she gets, she's now going to have to answer the perfect way, just to be able to say, I hadn't thought about that. Or maybe there's actually some ways that you and I agree on this. And maybe there's some questions that we don't even know how to answer.
Yeah.
And so it takes it away from this one extreme or the other to, boy, there's just a lot we don't know, and there's a lot we still need to figure out, and there's probably more common ground here than probably more common ground than we even want to admit is there.
Yeah.
Which is another issue I don't like about the whole us versus them, is it always puts a solution in somebody else's hands, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think that one thing we certainly have in common is that we all have that human brain, which has that defense mechanism, right? Which has the instinct to protect and to be safe, and therefore to hang with like-minded, folks, where I mitigate exclusion from the tribe, and I increase my ability to just know that, this is the way things work around here. And when someone challenges that, to your point, it makes me feel like, well, wait a second. If I believe this and that's not true, then how do things work around? Oh my gosh.
Right.
But that's the one thing we all have in common. To your point, if you even just consider asking people, wow, this is interesting to recognize as a human that I have these fixed biases. Even that, if we could all agree on that, as opposed to some people having these rigid, oh no, I don't. My biases are actually factual based and et cetera. Even that, if we could come to agreement, it would actually bring more people together than apart.
And especially on these issues, the folks that I respect in it, regardless of their positions, are the ones that say, I know I don't have all this figured out.
Yeah.
But here's some things that I think I believe, right? Or here's how I was raised. I mean, even if they can give you the why to where they got there, We could talk about the what, but it's too often the people that absolutely know that what they have is, I've got 100% of the facts. I know everything. I know what you're thinking. I know what this person's thinking. I mean, all that is, yeah. There's such an arrogance sometimes in what we believe to be true, when most of us, I mean, we don't know what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
To any level of certainty. We may know what we've heard from other people. We may know what our experience is. And I think that that's where, when you ask good questions, when you actually do some of the research, where you have conversations instead of arguments,
Yeah.
all of a sudden you realize, okay, there's a lot we don't know. How do we explore this together?
Yeah.
How could we come up with some potential solutions that both make sense with my values and what I believe, and what you value and what you believe, and still get to the same spot?
Yeah. Well, and that's where it really connects back to the notion of moving into recovery and developing resilience before we hit the next thing, whether it's a crisis or big C, small c, next wave, whatever, um, is without that mindset, right? Without that open-minded willingness to see a perspective other than your own, it's really tough to move into that future forward space. And it's tough to develop that resiliency for the next thing, because then we're even more entrenched, right? We've become even less flexible, so that the next wave, instead of like surfing it, it crashes right into us again.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too. So as I talk, my mother's 83 years old. Um, I grew up around my grandparents. A lot of their older friends were kind of in and around the area when I was growing up. So I worked with a lot of people over 65, 70, 80 years old. I think it's interesting when you talk to them about what they think about life when they're 70 or 80 years old versus what they thought as a 20, 30, 40-year-old. And just this whole thing of, I'm just, the only thing I'm sure of is that I don't know as much as I thought I did. Right.
Mm.
And I think earlier in life, we think we know so much about maybe a small handful of things. As we get older, we realize there are a lot of things we don't know very much about.
Yeah.
And I think for some of them who realize that, there is a little bit of a softening of, I do want to understand more, or I can be a little bit more curious. But when you're 22 years old, straight out of college, and you think you know the world and how the world should work, and you're just less open to that. And I'm not saying all 22-year-olds are like that, or all 85-year-olds are like that, but for me, that whole piece of acknowledging what I think I know, but acknowledging all the things I know very little about, but I've also created biases around, is a good first step for me to be able to say, okay, time out. Let's talk about this. You teach me something. Maybe I can teach you something, and where do we meet in the middle on that?
Yeah. And that connects to our conversations that we've had a lot about leadership too, which is, really generally agreed upon leadership trait is that self-awareness, right? Of what I know and what I don't know, and why I surround myself with people who I would like to understand better, and I would like to have their perspectives tabled and their ideas tabled, and I would like to facilitate dialogue amongst those people, because as an effective leader, what I want to do is leverage and optimize all of that amazing potential in all of these people, because hey, what the heck do I know, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And being open and vulnerable about that, right? And being able to say, hey guys, I want your perspectives. I want your input. I want to learn from you. I don't know everything. And there are going to be some things that I thought I knew that I step on my own, feet and my toes about, because I realize, what I thought was true is not.
Yeah.
Um, the other piece of this that I've been challenged by, and as we talk about the kind of the us versus them, or even just the polar opposites, is, um, and specific to the conversations around race, most recently, is this thought process that you're either in one camp or you're the other. You either support Black Lives Matter, or you support white supremacy, or you support equal rights, or you support slavery. Whatever you can do there. The issue that I have with that is there's a large amount of people, and I'll count myself in the middle of this, which are in some ways completely oblivious to some of the things going on. Not because, and I don't think it's ignorance for ignorance sake. Like, I don't want to know.
Yeah.
I think some of it's just like, that has not been my experience.
Yeah.
I'd like to learn more. I don't know how to ask I don't even know what I don't know.
Yeah.
And so it's more this, the ignorance in the middle is almost a quest to be more educated. But when we separate those camps and we ask somebody then, okay, well, Catherine, which side are you on? All of a sudden I get rid of all those questions and I have to pick based on what I do know, which is probably this much.
Yeah.
And so what we do is we lose out on a chance for people to get educated.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why, my challenge to myself was once a week, I'm going to dig into a different perspective around race that I didn't grow up with. As a young farm kid in a small rural community in the middle of Iowa, my experience was very white, middle class. And it's not because I wasn't open to anything else. It just, that was my perspective.
Yeah.
Now, as a much older man, I say, okay, now I look at the world and realize not only do they not, maybe have the same perspective or same experience, there's a whole lot of questions that I have that I'm not sure how I ask right now.
Yeah.
Because it comes across, it's like I'm asking everybody to take a pause on the argument to clarify a couple points.
Yeah. Which you kind of are. And like that's like ties it to the binary thinking, which is, hey, excuse me, I got a question. Can we just like pause for a second? Like, can you just put the gloves down for a second? I'm not even sure to whom I'm asking this question. If it's you or you, I just want to like time out here, right? I think, and that's what I too have been trying to educate myself. Same notion of, it's kind of like, asking a fish to describe water, right? We've talked about that analogy before, which is that if you grow up with what you have, then that's what you have. And the notion of even accepting that I could have some implicit bias that I might not want to accept, because generally my self-concept is A, B, and C. And even educating and learning and questioning honestly, courageously, uncomfortably, what some of those implicit biases might be is really interesting. And then saying, okay, well, what am I going to do with that? And who should I be talking to? Like right now, like you, I'm not just reading and watching. I'm trying to talk to people who have had different experiences and journeys than me. And I mean, I have to say, I feel sorry for some of my Black friends right now, because I think they're just having everybody call them like, hey man, can I just ask you some questions? And they're like, okay, yeah, you can call me Friday at 1 o'clock. I've got like, all my other white friends are calling me all week long, right? Which I just think it's interesting because on the one hand, I notice how full of it I am sometimes. Like, I think I have the answer, and then I'm like, I don't really have the answer. Like, I think I've drawn a conclusion. I'm like, yeah, but again, that's still coming from a very narrow-minded perspective, of, right. Oh, it's been 4 weeks since I've been, really immersing myself in this. And it's an ongoing, the notion actually to dismantle this kind of racism, systemic, whether it's racism, misogyny, hatred in general, hatred and violence in general. We should want to dismantle institutionalized hatred. It's not going to happen over a few weeks.
And it's not going to happen over even a couple of discussions, right? Yeah. And I think it's sometimes what is so both disheartening and frustrating about the processes we're going through. Like you mentioned, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's race relations, whether it's politics, and is most of us are not wired for a marathon.
Yeah.
We want to just have a couple of discussions, or we want to have a debate and there's a winner and there's a loser and we move on. And when you have something that's gone on for hundreds of years, or you have two different global perspectives based on how those two countries have changed and modified over time, or their systems of government, and then we get into these big clashes and we don't realize that that's not something that's going to be won in an argument, or won even sometimes on a battlefield.
Yeah.
it really is going to take time, and for us to be able to see other perspectives, and instead of filling in the blanks, well, I saw A and I saw D, so somewhere in there must be, B, C, and I don't know that to be true, but that's the line I'm going to draw. And now I think I've got the answer.
Yeah. And I think about, again, our sort of relief, recovery, resilience. This is very much in the resilience space, because to your point around, not going to happen over one conversation or one argument, um, it will take time and it will be tiring. Like, people will get fatigued. There are
Yeah.
some days where I'm like, I'm overwhelmed with all of these big issues that I'm trying to unpack. I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to learn. I'm trying to be optimistic. Some days I'm not. Some days it's fatiguing. So even
Oh
that
yeah.
necessitates the awareness of, so then what do I do when we're in the recovery space, building resilience, trying to still, raise a family, put kids through university, run a business, be a good, whatever, mother, sister, friend, like all of those things, community member. It's important to notice, I had this conversation with a friend of mine today who's very, very passionate about social justice and in a variety of ways, and institutional injustice. And one of his good friends said to him, I get why you're so passionate, but hey man, like, relax, like, life, just live. Like, you're so stressed out all the time. Just live. It's okay. And I said to him, that's interesting, because I'm going to have a conversation with Joel about binary thinking. So isn't even that's an example of, you can either be passionate about social injustice or just take a chill pill and relax. I'm like, so I said to him, well, why can't you kind of be both and learn to understand yourself better so that you can kind of ride it, where, if you've been doing a lot of this, okay, take a chill and relax, and then you can do this. And he was like, yeah. So that's a great example where we're either these kind of laid back, go with the flow people, or we're these raging activists. I'm like, well, I think there's a lot in between.
Right. And and that's where I'll go back to the nuances, right? It's the if you're a conservative in the United States, well, then you must hate the environment. And for myself, I'm probably considered more of a social and fiscal conservative, but I spend a significant amount of time working with causes around um, environmental impact, right? So composting programs and all these different things that are going on. And so from the outside, if you just take that one data point on me, you would say, well,
Yeah.
He wants the whole world to burn up, and
Yeah.
the flip side of that is, when you look at the discussions that we have, it's funny to me that we can't spot the bias. So I'll go to politics, and I'm sure goes everywhere, but in the United States, for example, if one side of the equation does something, the other side screams how horrible it is until their administration takes over and does the same thing and waits for the other side to scream how horrible it is.
Yeah.
And so at no point do we go, wait a second, we felt like this was wrong before. And so the response of, well, you guys did it, so we should be able to,
Yeah.
doesn't hold a lot of water.
No, it doesn't.
But that's where polarization works, right? It's always about, what's my response to someone else doing something? What's my reaction? How can I distance myself to the opposite extreme, instead of going to the middle and saying, well, time out. Maybe there are some situations where this makes sense, and other situations where it doesn't. And how could we agree on that, right?
Yeah.
And if we understand that, then it's not as, we're not so susceptible to running back to our corners to fight again.
Well, and I couldn't agree more. And as a taxpayer, that scenario and process drives me nuts, because it doesn't matter who you elect, nothing's going to get done. Because when they try to actually work together, they go, sorry, you're on that team and we're going to disagree with everything. Why? Because you won and we lost, and we're taking our toys and going home. Right? And like you said, you could take the same issue, they could do it, and then it's, come on, what are you for? Like, let's try to move forward.
And think about the immense impact that has on trust.
Oh.
Like, even if you consider yourself on one team or the other, when you see your team and you go, wait, we just did exactly what we said we shouldn't be doing, but we've made it that it's okay when we do it, but not okay when somebody else does it.
Yeah.
So do I trust my side but I don't think I trust the other side. So now I just sit in the middle and distrust everybody.
Well, and
I don't feel
then
like anything's going to get done.
and you likely have low voter turnout. I know we do.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
people become apathetic and because trust is eroded because they go, well, whatever. It doesn't really matter. And quite frankly, I do think that systemically with partisan politics, which generally I think that the world has, unfortunately, yeah, we all kind of fall into that. You know, you're voting for a team. It doesn't really matter. Many of the issues are again very binary,
Yeah.
and they're blanketed with, you know, certain things. And I don't think that it helps us actually progress, schedule,
Yes.
tomato.
Oh, no. Now we're in this again.
Is it with a U or no? Color,
You
favorite,
Canadians and your
behavior.
fancy talking.
I like to add U's everywhere. But you say U's. That's interesting.
Yeah, we're the U's. Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah. Anyway, so I do think it just sort of in wrapping up our conversation, perhaps, one of the most important just human behavioral shifts that we can all be making right now, with all of this stuff going on within and outside the world of work, within and outside the world of leadership, is to notice that sort of perhaps instinctual or inherent leaning towards binary thinking, even just recognizing it, and even just beginning to cultivate more of an open question asking mindset, you know?
Right. Yeah, that's been the best thing for me, and not just over the last 3 months, but just in general, of be okay asking questions and be okay asking the stupid questions, because it's typically the stupid questions that are the building blocks for a lot of the things, a lot of the ways that we draw sides.
Yeah.
It's I don't really understand where this came from, but if I ask somebody, I'm going to look stupid.
Yeah.
And because I don't want to look stupid, I'm just going to identify with something that is stupid.
Yeah.
And polarizing. So asking questions for me, just and being willing to say, I just don't know. I think that's an interesting perspective, Catherine. I don't know a lot about it. I'm going to have to dig in. I'm going to have to do some research. I'm going to have some other conversations to understand, all the different perspectives on that. I think for me, that's been key.
Yeah. And even to be able to say, thank you for sharing, and I still don't understand it, and I still don't know, and I'm going to need a little bit of time to continue to explore that even in my head, because if I've been operating with a certain belief system for many, many, many years, decades, centuries, who knows, I'm going to have to put it through a couple of filters before, and I might have to come back and ask the same question. Now, help me understand that again.
Yeah. Yeah. I will say this. I think the hard part for me, and I think this is human, but I'm just going to talk for Joel, is when somebody shares what they believe, that I don't automatically, it's almost like when you're supposed to be listening to somebody, you're not listening to respond, you're supposed to listen to understand.
Yeah.
And for me, too often, if somebody says, well, this is what I believe, and I feel like it's directionally not correct with what I think I believe, the emotion starts to build up in me, and I almost go into this defense posture. And so just being able to say, tell me a little bit more about that, right? Help me understand where you got there. Not so that I can beat that up, but to be able to go, I hadn't considered that. And if they ask me what I think, I can say, here's what I believe, and here's how I got there. And at least then we know where we're coming from, and
Yeah.
we can state that's just my bias. I joke with you quite often, but I do this quite often. I know, as a farm kid in the middle of white Iowa, where we have extreme temperatures and all this kind of stuff throughout the year, that my perspective is very different than somebody that lives in Atlanta, Georgia, or in Alaska, or in Canada, or elsewhere, right? But what I forget is the fact that I I can't see through their eyes. And so
Yeah.
I think everybody sees through my eyes. So be able to say, hey, this is my perspective because of how I've grown up, where I've grown up, the people I know. I'm very open to other perspectives, but I just don't have them.
Yeah.
So you're going to have to share yours with me so I can learn.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. I can see through your eyes, but